always thought my mom and I had an unbreakable bond. She was the kind of mother who stayed up with me when I had nightmares, who cheered at every little success, and who always knew exactly what to say when life felt unbearable. We weren't just family, we were a team, a duo that laughed at the world and found comfort in each other's presence. But everything began to shift the day she introduced him. I remember it vividly. I had come home from college for a weekend, excited to see her, to catch up over coffee and her homemade cookies. When she opened the door, a smile so wide it almost hurt. But she wasn't alone. Standing behind her was a man I didn't know, tall, with a confident grin and a firm handshake that tried to convince me he belonged here, like he was supposed to be part of our world. "This is Daniel," she said, her voice bright but with a hint of nervousness I hadn't heard before. "I've been seeing him for a while." I forced a polite smile, extended my hand, and said the usual pleasantries, but my gut twisted. There was something in the way he looked at her, protective, territorial, and the way she leaned slightly toward him, just the tiniest bit, made my stomach sink. It wasn't the closeness itself, but the intensity, as if our shared space was suddenly being redefined without my permission. At first, I tried to welcome him. I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe he was good for her. Maybe I was just protective and emotional because he was new. But from the first weekend, subtle things began to happen. Dinner that night was different. Daniel sat in the chair I usually claimed at the table. Mom didn't notice, or maybe she didn't want to. She laughed at his jokes, and I tried to join in, but I couldn't find my usual place in our conversations. I felt invisible, and the more I tried to insert myself, the more he seemed to redirect her attention, subtly isolating me, questioning my stories, undermining me without ever seeming rude. "You sure you remember that, right?" he'd ask, his tone casual but laced with condescension. "I think you're exaggerating, don't you?" And my mom? She nodded along. She didn't correct him. She didn't defend me. She just smiled apologetically, like I was being difficult. At first, I brushed it off. Maybe he was just protective. Maybe I was imagining things. But the incidents multiplied. Small things: she started consulting him before making decisions we used to make together. Dinner plans, holiday schedules, even weekend trips. Every choice she made was filtered through his approval, and if I tried to object, she gently brushed me off, saying, "Honey, Daniel and I decided this. You'll understand later." It wasn't just decisions. It was the way she looked at me. Her eyes, once warm and patient, now held a kind of apologetic distance, as if she was trying to make sure I didn't see the truth. She was slowly choosing him over me. I tried to talk to her about it. One quiet evening, I asked her in the kitchen, leaning against the counter, with the soft hum of the refrigerator filling the silence, "Mom, do you think Daniel is, I don't know, putting us at odds?" She paused, wiped her hands on a towel, and smiled weakly. "What do you mean, baby?" I feel like you're prioritizing him over me, over us." Her lips tightened. She sighed, not out of frustration, but exhaustion, and said, "Sweetheart, it's not like that. I care about him too. He's important to me." But it wasn't enough. Her words didn't erase the growing weight in my chest, the creeping suspicion that I was being edged out of my own life. The signs became undeniable. He was always there, always around, always involved. My mom would check in with him before returning my calls or messages. She started asking his opinion on things we used to handle together. She would laugh at his jokes, roll her eyes at mine, or dismiss my thoughts without realizing how sharp her actions felt. I tried to maintain hope. Maybe it was temporary. Maybe she just needed time to balance her feelings for him with her love for me. Maybe I was reading too much into it. But then came the first unmistakable betrayal. It was a Thursday night. I had spent the afternoon with her, helping her organize the house, talking about plans for the weekend, laughing like we always did. I left briefly to grab a coffee from the corner store, expecting to return to our usual warmth. When I came back, she wasn't alone. And he wasn't just there. He was seated comfortably on her favorite chair, scrolling through her phone. I froze in the doorway. "Hey," I said, my voice shaky. "Oh, you're back," Mom said casually. Daniel looked up with that same self-assured grin. "Hey, kiddo." I didn't move. Something in me screamed that this wasn't okay. He laughed lightly and held up her phone. "Just going through some messages. Making sure everything's in order. You know, keeping things balanced." The word stabbed me. Mom didn't intervene. She just nodded and smiled weakly, her eyes flicking briefly toward me as if she expected me to understand. But I didn't. I couldn't. That night, lying awake in my childhood bedroom, I replayed every interaction, every subtle manipulation, every moment he had inserted himself between us. I felt powerless, invisible, betrayed. The person I had trusted most in the world was slowly choosing him over me, and I didn't know how to stop it. It wasn't just a romantic relationship anymore, it was a wedge. A silent, cruel wedge that kept growing, separating me from the person I had always relied on most. And I realized something terrifying. This wasn't about love. This was about control. By the time I drifted into an uneasy sleep, I had made a silent promise to myself. I would find out why. Why he was doing this. Why my mother was letting it happen. And no matter what it took, I wouldn't let this go unnoticed. I didn't know yet what that path would look like. I didn't know what secrets I would uncover. I didn't know how far his manipulations went or how deep my mother had been and influenced. But I knew one thing, I couldn't let this betrayal continue. And that was the moment my quiet, safe world began to unravel. It was the beginning of the storm. The days that followed felt heavier than anything I had experienced before. Every time I walked into the kitchen, every time I called her on the phone, every time I tried to share a small moment, he was there, always watching, always filtering what my mother saw. It was subtle at first, almost invisible. But over time it became impossible to ignore. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe he was protective because he cared about her. Maybe my imagination was painting things darker than they were. But every action, every word, every tiny gesture made me feel more like an intruder in my own family home. I had grown up in this house. I had shared secrets with my mother here. And now it felt like I was being edged out of the life I had known. I remember one evening in particular. I had called her, excited to tell her about a promotion I'd received at work. My voice was light, full of pride, full of hope. She answered, but before I could finish my first sentence, he cut in, speaking over me, guiding her attention away. Are you sure you're telling her that? Maybe she doesn't need to worry about that right now, he said, smiling at her in that way that made it clear he was the one in charge. My mom laughed nervously. Oh, maybe he's right, she said, brushing my accomplishment aside. We'll talk later. Later never came. I felt a punch in my chest. That familiar ache of being invisible, of being dismissed, of being replaced. The helplessness I had tried to ignore was now undeniable. I tried to speak up again, politely, softly, hoping she would hear me over him. But she didn't. She smiled apologetically, nodded, and said, let's not make this a thing, okay? It was never about making things a thing anymore. It was about me slowly losing my place in her world. I tried confiding in friends, hoping someone would validate what I was feeling. I described the constant undermining, the subtle control, the way he had inserted himself between my mother and me. Their responses were the same, half sympathy, half doubt. Maybe you're imagining things, one friend said. Maybe she's just excited about her new relationship. But I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't overreacting. And I could feel my own voice, my own presence, slipping further into the background, becoming quiet, almost non-existent. Every time I was around them together, I felt the air shift. It wasn't hostility, it was manipulation. He had a way of turning simple decisions into minefields, of subtly making my mother question me, of slowly rewriting her perception of who I was and what I mattered. And she was letting him. She didn't see it or she didn't want to. Either way, I was powerless. The helplessness became tangible. I started avoiding her calls, not because I didn't want to speak, but because every conversation left me exhausted, drained, questioning myself. I felt trapped in a world where my own mother's love was being filtered, distorted, controlled. I tried to remind myself that she loved me, that we were family, that this was temporary, but the evidence kept stacking against me. One night, I watched them from the living room while my mom was telling a story about her day. I was quiet, pretending to be distracted by my phone, but I saw everything. The way he interrupted her mid-sentence, the way he leaned slightly closer to her, as if claiming her attention, the way she laughed at his jokes, even the ones I knew were cruel, even the ones that subtly dismissed me. I felt my chest tighten, my throat ached, my hands shook. I wanted to scream, to run, to shake my mother awake and tell her what was happening. But she wouldn't hear me. She couldn't, not while he was there, shaping her perception, bending her attention toward him. It wasn't just emotional, it was physical too. I noticed small things. My room, once a place of safety and warmth, felt less welcoming. He would casually comment on furniture I had picked out, on the photos I had hung, on the way I had organized my space. Each remark was delivered like a casual observation, but it carried weight designed to make me question myself. My mother didn't intervene. She smiled politely, nodded, and let it pass. The tipping point came during a family dinner. I had invited my mom over to celebrate my recent achievement at work, a big step in my career that I had wanted to share with her first. But when we sat down, she seemed distracted. He dominated the conversation, asking questions that only highlighted my mistakes, pointing out small errors in my presentation, casually undermining my confidence. My mother, instead of defending me, laughed nervously and said, yes, he's right, maybe I misremembered. I felt a cold, heavy wave crash over me. I realized that night that I wasn't just ignored, I was being erased. My achievements, my feelings, my place in my own family were being systematically diminished, and I couldn't fight it alone. I couldn't break through the invisible wall he had built between my mother and me. I tried again, late that night, sitting on the edge of my bed with my laptop open. I sent a long, heartfelt message to my mother, explaining exactly how I felt. I didn't accuse. I didn't attack. I just laid out the truth, the subtle manipulations, the sidelining, the invisible suffocating weight of her choosing him over me. I hit send, hoping she would read it, hoping she would understand. The reply came hours later. It wasn't what I expected. Oh honey, I didn't realize you felt this way. I love you. But Daniel is a good man, and he means a lot to me. Can we talk about this later?" Later never came, and that's when the helplessness fully settled in. I realized that I couldn't rely on her to see through his manipulation. I couldn't depend on her to protect our bond, and worst of all, I couldn't ignore the fact that he had succeeded in changing her perception, in isolating me emotionally, in slowly shifting the balance of power in their relationship. I spent the following weeks in a fog of fear and anxiety, avoiding confrontations because I didn't know what would happen if I did. The more I tried to assert myself, the more distant my mother became. She was always polite, always warm, but always subtly siding with him. She didn't mean to hurt me, I kept telling myself. She just couldn't see it, and yet, something inside me refused to give up. Even in my darkest moments, I was observing, remembering, taking mental notes. Every slip, every inconsistency, every subtle manipulation was being cataloged. Because deep down, I knew that someday, somehow, the truth would have to come out. And when it did, I had to be ready. I didn't know how or when that moment would arrive. I didn't know if my mother would choose to believe me or him. But I knew one thing, I wasn't powerless anymore. I might feel helpless now, trapped in a web of favoritism and deception. But I had eyes, I had ears, and I had a mind that wouldn't forget a single detail. That night, I made a silent vow to myself. I would uncover the truth. I would wait for the right moment. And I would make sure that the man who thought he could replace me in my mother's heart didn't get away with it, even if it took everything I had, even if it meant walking through darkness. I would not let this betrayal go unanswered, because helplessness can be temporary but awareness is permanent, and mine had finally awakened. By now, I wasn't just feeling helpless anymore, I was on alert. Every interaction, every word, every small gesture was under my scrutiny. I had learned the hard way that appearances could be deceiving, that warm smiles and polite words could mask control, manipulation, and selfish agendas. And Daniel, my mom's boyfriend, was full of them. It started with little things. In conversations with my mom, I noticed subtle inconsistencies in what he said versus what I knew to be true. One night, over a quiet dinner, my mom mentioned that Daniel had told her he worked late at the office. I had casually asked him the same question earlier in the day, expecting the usual routine reply. Instead, he had said, "Yeah, I have a meeting tonight but nothing major." But my mom's recounting was different. She said he told her he'd be home around PM, and that he wanted to spend the evening together. That small difference didn't seem like much, but something in the way she hesitated, in the way she avoided my gaze, told me it wasn't just an accident. Then came the social media clues. He was always careful about what he posted, or rather, about what my mother saw. Pictures of us together, happy family moments, were strangely absent from his feed. He shared photos with friends and colleagues, but never a single image with her daughter. At first, I brushed it off. Maybe he was private. Maybe he wanted to keep work and family separate. But combined with everything else, the pieces began forming a troubling pattern. I started observing him more closely. The way he smiled at my mother, protective, possessive, always measuring her reactions. The way he subtly corrected her stories in front of me, making her doubt her own memory or decisions. The way he framed conversations so that he appeared reasonable, thoughtful, rational, while casting me as dramatic, emotional, or overreacting. Every small interaction, every carefully timed remark, seemed designed to create a wedge between my mother and me. And my mother, completely unaware or unwilling to admit it, was slowly falling into his orbit. I decided to start gathering evidence. Not for revenge, not yet, but to understand. To confirm what my gut had been screaming for months, that he wasn't here for her. And he certainly wasn't here for me. The first breakthrough came when I overheard him speaking on the phone in the living room while my mom was out running errands. He was speaking softly, almost conspiratorially, and I could only catch fragments of the conversation. "She has no idea. Thinking she's in control. Yes, just keep her distracted. Make her feel special while we work on everything else. She's too naive to see it coming." I froze in place. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it, even though he was too focused on the call to notice me standing in the hallway. Those words, they weren't vague. They weren't casual. They were a plan. And I was suddenly seeing him for what he really was, a man who had infiltrated our lives with one goal in mind: control and advantage. That night, I replayed everything in my head. Every disagreement he'd subtly instigated, every time my mom had seemed confused, every moment I'd felt dismissed. All of it connected. The gaslighting, the manipulation, the strategic charm. It wasn't random. It was calculated. I started keeping notes. Everything. Times, dates, conversations, phrases he used repeatedly. I even noted when he tried to isolate my mother from me or her friends. Every observation felt like a piece of armor being forged, preparing me for the inevitable confrontation. Then came the day that pushed me further down the trail of discovery. I was helping my mom organize some old family documents in the study when Daniel walked in. He casually asked what we were doing, leaning against the doorway with that infuriating grin. I caught a glimpse of his phone on the desk. It had been left unlocked. A small, risky mistake on his part. I didn't touch it. I just glanced. And that glance revealed more than I could have hoped for. There were messages, carefully worded, between him and someone I didn't know, discussing strategies, finances, and how to position my mom in certain situations. Plans, manipulations, hidden agendas. Every message confirmed my suspicions. suspicions, but the red flags weren't just in words, they were in actions. I started noticing patterns in his behavior, the way he suggested that I needed to learn responsibility whenever I tried to assert myself, the way he subtly praised himself in front of my mom, the way he framed my concerns as misunderstandings to make her doubt me. I began to feel a mix of fear and resolve. Fear, because he was clever, and he had been operating right under my nose for months. Resolve, because now I had the proof. Now I knew that my suspicions were valid, and now I could plan my next move. And then, the first slip happened. A casual comment, almost offhanded, in the kitchen while my mother was away. He was speaking to a friend on speakerphone, thinking I wasn't paying attention. But I was. She's so attached to her mom, it's ridiculous. She needs to be taught her place. Once that's done, everything else is easy. I froze. The words echoed in my mind, clear as day. He wasn't just controlling her, he was controlling the narrative around me. He didn't want me removed completely, he wanted me managed, contained, powerless. I knew then that waiting was no longer an option. The helplessness I had felt for weeks shifted into determination. I had to confront him, or at least gather enough evidence so that my mother could see the truth. I started carefully planning. I paid attention to how he spoke, who he trusted, and how he manipulated situations to isolate me. I took mental notes of when my mother seemed most vulnerable to his influence. Every slip, every inconsistency, every careless word became part of a puzzle I was determined to solve. By now, even my friends noticed the change in me. They saw how tense I had become, how cautious, how observant. They didn't understand every detail, but they understood enough to offer support. Some warned me I was overthinking, some advised patience, but I had crossed a threshold. I could no longer ignore the truth. And then, the first moment of real hope appeared. One evening, Daniel said something in front of my mom that didn't make sense. A detail contradicted an earlier story he had told her, a tiny inconsistency, but enough to catch her attention. For the first time, I saw a flicker of doubt in her eyes. A crack in the armor he had so carefully constructed. That crack was all I needed. I realized that the trail of red flags and discoveries was leading to one inevitable moment. The truth would be revealed. And when it did, it had the potential to shatter not just his control, but the illusion he had built around my mother. The helplessness of the past weeks had been replaced by clarity. The fear that had paralyzed me was slowly being replaced by strategy. I wasn't naive anymore. I wasn't invisible. And I wasn't going to be sidelined in my own life, because sometimes, the hardest part of a story isn't the betrayal itself, it's noticing it, documenting it, and waiting for the right moment to act. And that moment was coming. I didn't sleep the night I heard him say I needed to be taught my place. Those words kept replaying in my head like a warning siren. By morning, something inside me had shifted. I wasn't afraid of him anymore, I was studying him, planning around him, preparing for him. If he thought I was the naive kid in the corner, he was about to learn how wrong he was. The first step was simple: observe him without letting him know I was observing. I kept my voice calm, my expressions neutral. I stopped reacting emotionally, which threw him off. Daniel fed off reactions, he needed them. He needed to feel like every word he said carried weight, but I refused to give him that satisfaction. Instead, I watched, studied, calculated. Then I started testing him, lightly pushing his limits to see where he cracked. Like the evening he claimed he had a big work meeting, I casually asked, "Oh, with who again?" He blinked too long. My manager, right," I said, nodding as if satisfied. "What's his name again?" A pause, a flicker of panic. "Tom," he said. "Funny. Last week, his manager was named Charles." My mom didn't catch the lie, but I did. And when I turned away, I caught his eyes sharpening on me like a threat. He knew I was noticing things, and I knew he knew, which meant I had to move fast. I made the decision to set a trap slowly, carefully, without giving him any room to redirect blame. The kind of trap where he would reveal himself without realizing it. And so began the smallest, quietest rebellion. I started spending more time with my mother when he wasn't around. Not to talk about him, not yet, but to rebuild a connection he had been slowly eroding. I helped her with groceries, watched movies with her, cooked dinner together. I reminded her what our home felt like before he entered it. It was subtle, but I knew it bothered him. He hated not being the center of her world, and every time he returned to find us laughing or cooking or simply existing without him, I saw the faint twitch in his jaw. The irritation he tried to hide. Still, the trap needed bait. And the bait had to be something he couldn't resist. The biggest thing Daniel couldn't handle was not knowing everything. He needed control, information, power. So I decided to give him the illusion that I was hiding something important enough for him to chase. I placed a small notebook on my desk, purposefully visible, slightly open, with vague lines scribbled inside. Nothing incriminating, just words like timeline, contradictions, and mom. enough to make someone like him curious, enough to feel like a threat. Then I waited. It didn't take long. One afternoon, I returned home from school earlier than usual, quietly. No footsteps, no unlocking of doors, just silence. And there he was standing in my doorway, holding the notebook, flipping the pages, his expression sharp and calculating. He hadn't heard me yet. His guard was down. His mask was off. "Find what you were looking for," I said, startling him. He jumped slightly, then plastered on a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Oh hey, I was just checking if you needed new school supplies." "Right, because grown men randomly go through notebooks for that reason." I didn't accuse him. "That was part of the trap." "Thanks," I said softly. "I'll let you know if I need anything." I walked away without another word. Let him drown in the paranoia of what I might know, or what I might be planning. From that day forward, he watched me more closely. Too closely. Every move I made, every room I entered, his eyes followed. He was slipping, breaking the calm facade he had maintained so well around my mom. Good, that was the point. The second stage of the trap was more direct. I started mentioning strange things happening around the house. Not accusations, just comments designed to stir his anxiety. Like, "Mom, did you take the old documents from the study? They were moved," or, "I swear I heard someone walking outside my room last night." Nothing too obvious, but enough to make him feel watched, exposed. Meanwhile, I collected every inconsistency he uttered, every lie, every contradiction, every late-night phone call where he whispered more than spoke, every time he slipped and revealed intentions my mother would never willingly overlook. The more he feared being found out, the more careless he became. And the more careless he became, the easier it was to catch him. One night, around midnight, I heard him talking on the phone again, this time louder than before. Agitated, frustrated. "I'm working on it. She's not supposed to be here this much. No, she's ruining the plan. Yes, I'm trying to isolate them, but the kid's everywhere. She's smarter than I thought." The kid, that was me. My heart raced, not from fear, but from validation. The trap was working. He was panicking, but the final step needed more than just whispers and inconsistencies. It needed something undeniable, something my mom couldn't ignore or excuse. I didn't want to set up cameras, yet not without a reason that wouldn't scare my mom or tip Daniel off. So instead, I set a conversational trap. I waited until dinner, an ordinary Tuesday, calm and uneventful. Daniel was in a good mood, joking about work, laughing to heart at his own stories. My mom was enjoying the peace. Perfect. I casually mentioned something he had told my mom earlier in the week. Then, seconds later, I mentioned what he had told me about the same event. Both versions were different. Opposites, actually. He realized too late. My mom froze. "What? Daniel, you said you were at the office dinner." He blinked. I was. I added quietly, "But you told me you were visiting a friend." The room went dead silent. For the first time, the mask slipped right in front of her. For the first time, she saw the crack, the lie, the manipulation, and the way he stared at me, cold, burning, furious. That was when I knew the real battle was coming. But the moment that changed everything, the moment he slipped and told the real reason he was here, was still ahead, and the trap I set was about to snap shut. The moment had finally arrived. Months of subtle observation, careful planning, and quiet patience had built to this point. I wasn't just ready, I had to act. Because by now, Daniel's manipulations weren't just emotional nuisances. They were poisoning the relationship I had with my mother. And I refused to stand by and watch any longer. It started with a casual comment, designed to provoke a reaction, nothing overt. Dinner that evening was calm, almost ordinary. My mom was humming as she plated food. Daniel was making small talk about work. I had already decided the angle. I would let him speak first, let him reveal himself, and only then would I step in. "So, you and your manager had a big strategy meeting this week?" I asked casually, leaning against the counter, my eyes calm, almost innocent. He froze just for a split second, before laughing. "Yes, of course. Why do you ask?" "Oh, no reason," I said lightly, letting my tone drop just enough to hint I knew more than I should. "I just remember you telling Mom a slightly different version the other day." Must have been confused. My mom, sensing the tension, looked between us. Her brow furrowed. "Wait, what do you mean?" Daniel laughed nervously, trying to redirect the conversation. "Nothing, honey. Just a misunderstanding." But the seed had been planted. That night, I followed up carefully. I didn't accuse. I didn't attack. I let his own words and his own pattern of lies do the talking. I reminded him of casual statements, little contradictions, all phrased as questions rather than confrontations. The tension built, layer by layer, like a storm about to break. He became jittery, over-explaining, stumbling over words he had once spoken confidently. And my mom began to notice. For the first time in months, her eyes weren't glazed over by trust or manipulated warmth. They were sharp, uncertain, questioning. "Daniel, are you sure about that?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Yes, of course, he replied, a little too quickly. No, I said softly, stepping closer. Not everything he says lines up, Mom. And I think it's time you hear the truth. Her eyes widened, and I could see the confusion, the doubt. She looked from me to him, searching for clarity, for the stability she had always relied on. But he was cracking. He began, his voice rising slightly. You have no idea what you're talking about. I let him rise. I let him get defensive. Because the more he defended himself, the more he revealed. And he didn't even realize he was doing it. I calmly started recounting incidents, dates, small lies, and manipulations he had made over the past months. I didn't exaggerate. I didn't embellish. I simply told the truth as I had observed it, and with each statement, his composure unraveled a little more. Then came the slip, the one I had been waiting for. He had been speaking to Mom about finances, pretending he was merely concerned for our family's well-being. But in a single careless phrase, he let the real reason slip. I just want to make sure she doesn't get in the way of what's mine, he muttered, barely audible. I froze. My mom froze. Wait, what? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. He laughed nervously, trying to backtrack. I didn't, that's not what I meant, but the damage was done. The truth had tumbled out, unfiltered, raw, undeniable. Mom's face went pale. She looked at me first, then at him. What did you just say? I mean, he stammered, panicked. I didn't. You were using me, weren't you? Mom's voice was sharp now, almost unrecognizable. You weren't here for me, you were here to manipulate everything, to control me and push her aside. I could see the anger building in her, the betrayal. She hadn't realized she had been blind to, and I could feel the vindication building in myself, not for revenge, but for truth. He was trying to explain, to rationalize, to spin it into a misunderstanding. But the evidence was undeniable. My months of careful observation, the notes, the contradictions, and now his own slip, it all pointed to one reality. Mom's voice shook with fury and disbelief. I can't believe I didn't see it. All this time, I trusted you, and you were playing games, trying to isolate my daughter from me, he faltered. Words no longer came easily. Every excuse sounded weaker than the last. I stepped closer to my mom, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. It's okay, Mom. You weren't seeing it because he was careful, but now you know, and that's all that matters. Her eyes welled with tears. She turned toward me fully, the warmth and love I had thought lost returning in full force. I'm so sorry. I should have listened. I should have trusted you. I shook my head softly. You did the best you could, but now you see the truth. That's what counts. Daniel's face went from panic to anger to helplessness. He realized that his control had evaporated in the span of a few minutes. The very dynamic he had tried to establish, the wedge between mother and daughter, was crumbling before his eyes. He tried one last time to manipulate the narrative, to shift blame. Mom, she's exaggerating. She's twisting everything I said. No. Mom snapped, her voice firm, stronger than I had heard in months. Enough. I see everything now. I understand what you were doing, and I will not let you manipulate us any longer. The room was silent for a moment. The tension was thick, heavy, almost suffocating. And in that silence, the balance of power had shifted completely. For the first time in months, I didn't feel invisible. I didn't feel sidelined. I felt seen. I felt validated. And most importantly, I felt a new sense of safety with my mom, one that wasn't controlled by anyone else's selfish intentions. Daniel finally realized the fight was over. He had been exposed, and he knew it. I could see it in his eyes, the panic, the frustration, the helplessness of a man who thought he could manipulate everything, only to be confronted with truth he couldn't control. Mom stepped closer to me, her hand holding mine tightly. I'm so sorry you had to go through this. I should have believed you from the start. I shook my head. It's okay. You believe me now, that's what matters. And just like that, the confrontation ended. Not with yelling or chaos, but with clarity, with truth, with exposure. I had waited, observed, and planned. And now the trap had worked. Daniel's own words had undone him, revealing the real reason he had been here all along. And my mother, finally seeing the reality for herself, understood. I realized then that the hardest part of any confrontation isn't standing up to the person, it's waiting for the moment when the truth becomes undeniable. The moment when their own actions speak louder than any argument, louder than any plea. And that moment had arrived. I looked at my mom, and she looked at me. And for the first time in months, I felt the world right again. The real battle wasn't just exposing him, it was rebuilding the trust, the bond that had been strained, the love that had been manipulated. But that could wait. For now, justice had been served. The veil had been lifted, and the storm had finally broken. The confrontation left a heavy silence in the house. Daniel had retreated to the living room, pretending to be calm, but the tension was almost tangible. Mom and I sat at the kitchen table, hands clasped, hearts still racing from the storm that had just passed. Yet, I knew this wasn't over. Not entirely. He was cunning, and he still had the ability to twist words, to spin excuses, to gaslight if given the chance. I had to be ready for his next move. And so, I watched carefully as he paced the living room, muttering under his breath, muttering more to himself than anyone else. Then it happened. A slip. A careless, unguarded slip that revealed the truth he had tried so hard to hide. I can't believe she knows. I mean, she's so stubborn, always thinking she sees everything. Mom doesn't know, and if she did, it would ruin everything, he muttered, louder than he realized. I froze. That was it. That one phrase. That one casual line told me exactly what I needed to know. It wasn't just control. It wasn't just influence. He had an agenda, something bigger, something self-serving, something he had been hiding from both of us all along. Mom's eyes narrowed. Wait, what did you just say? Her voice was firm now, the first time in months. She sounded like herself again, commanding, decisive. He blinked, realizing too late that he had spoken too much. I wasn't talking about you were talking about what you were planning, I said, standing. About how you've been manipulating us. About how you've been using me to keep Mom under your control. About why you're really here. He stammered, words fumbling out, but the weight of the revelation hung in the air. There was no denying it. No excuses. No diversion. Mom leaned forward, her voice shaking with a mixture of anger and betrayal. Tell me, why? Daniel's facade cracked completely. For the first time, I saw panic replace arrogance, fear replace confidence. He knew the jig was up, and in that moment, he made the mistake that would seal his fate. I thought I could. I mean, I wanted to protect you, Mom, and make sure she didn't interfere with us, he confessed, voice low, almost desperate. I blinked, processing what he had just said. Protect you? I echoed, disbelief coloring my tone. Protect you? By isolating me? By twisting your words? By making her doubt me at every turn? Mom's eyes welled with tears. All this time, you weren't honest. You weren't here for me. You were here for yourself. He hesitated, realizing that his words had destroyed whatever chance he had to maintain control. He opened his mouth, tried to rationalize, but I cut him off. Stop. Just stop. You've said enough. Your actions, your manipulations, your lies, they've spoken louder than anything you could ever claim. For the first time, he looked small, weak, vulnerable, and I realized something in that moment. Power isn't held by the one who schemes the longest. Power belongs to the one who knows the truth and isn't afraid to face it. Mom shook her head, anger and hurt mingling in her expression. I trusted you. I opened my life to you, and this is how you repay me. I didn't mean to hurt anyone, he said, voice barely audible. You didn't mean to? You destroyed months of trust and family bonds for what? Control? Pride? Some selfish agenda? I shouted, the emotions I had held in check for so long finally pouring out. He looked at me, and for a fleeting second, I saw a glimmer of fear. Not just for himself, but for the reality he had created. For the fact that his entire plan was unraveling before him, and then it hit me, the full scope of what he had been planning. It wasn't just about influencing my mom or isolating me. He had been trying to take over her decisions, her emotions, even her perceptions, all for his own benefit. Every little manipulation, every subtle lie, every seemingly innocent comment had been calculated to give him control over our family's life. Mom stood, her back straight, her eyes burning with clarity. You're done here. I don't want to see you again. And don't think for a second you can manipulate me anymore. His lips trembled. I just thought no. She interrupted, voice loud, unwavering. You thought wrong. And now, you're leaving. You will not harm us anymore. You are finished. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Not triumph, not satisfaction, but relief. The weight of months of manipulation, the helplessness, the subtle erosion of my place in our family, was finally lifted. The truth had come out. The lies were exposed. And he had nowhere to hide. For the first time in what felt like forever, my mother and I shared a moment of quiet understanding. No words were necessary. She knew I had been right. She understood what I had seen all along. And I knew she would never let anyone come between us again. Daniel left that night, a shadow of the confident man he had pretended to be. And while the emotional scars of his manipulation would take time to heal, the bond between my mother and me began to mend immediately. We sat together afterward, holding hands across the table, the tension gradually dissipating. My mother's voice was soft, but full of resolve. I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner. I should have believed you from the start. It's okay, I said. You know now, and that's what matters. We have each other. That's all that matters. And for the first time in months, I felt safe, whole, seen, and unbroken, because the truth had finally been revealed. And with it, the control he thought he had was gone forever. The storm had passed, but the clarity remained. And that clarity, sharp, undeniable, and powerful, was ours. The house felt different the next morning. Lighter, cleaner. The tension that had clung to every corner for months had dissipated, replaced by a quiet clarity that was almost tangible. Daniel was gone, leaving behind a trail of excuses, manipulations, and finally, undeniable truth. And for the first time in what felt like forever, my mother and I could breathe again. But the work wasn't over. The confrontation had revealed his agenda. But now the real challenge was reclaiming what had been lost, the trust, the bond, and the balance of power that had been eroded over months. We started with small steps, rebuilding routines that had been disrupted, meals together, conversations without interruptions, laughter that wasn't laced with fear or distraction. Every small act, every shared smile, every ordinary moment was a declaration that our bond was intact and stronger than before. Mom began to speak openly about everything Daniel had done. The way he had subtly undermined her decisions, isolated me, and manipulated situations for his own gain. It wasn't easy for her. She felt guilt, shame, even anger at herself for not noticing sooner. But the important part was that she acknowledged it, and that acknowledgement was powerful. "I can't believe I let him get away with it," she admitted one afternoon, her voice heavy with regret. "I should have trusted you from the start. I should have seen what was happening right in front of me." I shook my head gently. "It's not your fault, Mom. He was clever. And now we know. Now we can fix it." Fix it we did. Slowly, deliberately. Every time we felt the shadow of his manipulation lingering, we spoke up. Every decision, every plan, every conversation was reclaimed. We reminded ourselves and each other what it felt like to have agency, to have trust, to have love without interference. Then came the most empowering moment, the complete confrontation of his legacy. We began documenting everything. All the lies, all the manipulations, all the evidence we had gathered over the months. Not to punish, but to protect ourselves in the future. It was symbolic as much as practical, a declaration that we would never again allow someone to undermine our bond, and that declaration was transformative. My mother's confidence returned, bolstered by the realization that she had reclaimed control over her life. She no longer wavered in her decisions, no longer doubted herself, no longer allowed fear of confrontation to dictate her choices. And I, having witnessed the full extent of Daniel's deceit, felt a sense of empowerment I hadn't known before. We also began to set boundaries, clear, firm, non-negotiable boundaries. We discussed scenarios, potential future interactions with anyone who might try to manipulate us, and agreed that honesty and transparency would always come first. It wasn't about being paranoid. It was about safeguarding ourselves from anyone who sought to take advantage of love or trust. Again, as we rebuilt our bond, I noticed a subtle shift in our dynamic. Mom and I were closer than ever. We laughed more freely, shared more openly, and supported each other without hesitation. The shadow that Daniel had cast over our relationship had been replaced by light, clarity, and empowerment. One evening, as we sat in the living room, sipping tea, I reflected on everything that had happened. The helplessness, the observation, the careful planning, the confrontation, it had all led to this moment of clarity and power. And for the first time, I truly understood the strength of our relationship. "Do you feel free now?" I asked her quietly. She smiled, a slow, genuine smile that lit up her face. "Yes, free, and stronger. We've taken back what's ours, and nothing can touch that again." I nodded. "Exactly. No one can come between us. Not ever." The real power shift, I realized, wasn't just about exposing Daniel or proving him wrong. It was about reclaiming ourselves, reclaiming our voices, our decisions, our love. It was about establishing a bond so strong that no manipulation, no lies, no deceit could ever shake it again. And the sense of justice wasn't in punishment alone, it was in awareness, in reclaiming control, and in rebuilding trust. That was the ultimate victory. In the days that followed, we noticed subtle changes in our surroundings. Spaces that had felt tense or heavy now felt open, welcoming, safe. Conversations were honest, laughter was unguarded, and the sense of vigilance that had dominated every moment gradually faded. Mom began planning little things again, dinners, outings, even spontaneous adventures. And I joined her eagerly, knowing that these moments were ours, free from manipulation and fear. It was a reclamation of joy as much as it was a reclamation of control, and yet, beneath all of it, a quiet reminder remained. The power we had regained was precious, and it had been hard-won. The experience had changed us, sharpened us, made us more aware of the subtle dangers of trust and manipulation. But it had also made us stronger, closer, and more resilient. We also took the time to reflect on the emotional growth this ordeal had forced upon us. I had learned patience, strategy, and observation. Mom had learned discernment, boundaries, and the strength of her own intuition. Together, we had learned that even in the face of deceit, love and truth could prevail. In some ways, the aftermath was sweeter than any resolution we could have imagined. Because it wasn't just about removing a threat, it was about reclaiming our lives. About asserting that no one could ever manipulate our bond again. About proving that awareness, courage, and unity were more powerful than fear, lies, and control. By the end of the week, Daniel had been completely removed from our lives, and there was no turning back. The shift in power was absolute, unambiguous, and irrevocable. We no longer feared his influence, no longer doubted our judgment, and no longer tolerated manipulation in any form. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace settle over the household. It wasn't naive peace, it was the hard-earned calm that comes after stormy, turbulent waters. The kind of calm that reassures you that justice, even when slow, will always find its way. As I watched my mother organizing her study, humming softly, I realized that this experience, painful as it was, had strengthened us in ways nothing else could. It had exposed the cracks in our trust, but it had also shown us the resilience of our bond. And for that, I was grateful, because the storm had passed. The manipulator was gone, and the power, true, undeniable power, was finally back where it belonged, in our hands. The days after Daniel's departure were surreal. The house felt lighter, almost like it had been exhaling after holding its breath for months. Every room, every corner, seemed filled with a quiet sense of relief. And yet, even in that calm, I felt the echoes of everything that had happened: his manipulation, his lies, the months of tension that had clouded my relationship with my mother. We spent the first few mornings slowly reclaiming our routines. Breakfast together felt warmer, the conversations freer, and laughter flowed without the ever-present shadow of fear or tension. Mom would occasionally glance at me with a mixture of remorse and gratitude, and I knew she was still processing the enormity of what had occurred. One afternoon, as we were sorting through old photo albums, she paused at a picture of us from years ago. "I remember this day," she said softly, her eyes misty. "We were so carefree. I didn't realize how much I let outside influence affect us until now." I nodded. "It's okay, Mom. What matters is that we've come through it. We've reclaimed what's ours, our trust, our bond. That's what matters." And it did matter. Every lie Daniel had told, every subtle manipulation, had left scars. But those scars were also proof. Proof that we had endured, survived, and emerged stronger. The process of reflection was as much about understanding ourselves as it was about understanding him. I realized how much patience, observation, and restraint had been required to navigate his manipulations. Every detail I had noticed: the inconsistencies, the casual lies, the ways he attempted to isolate me, was a lesson in vigilance, awareness, and strategy. I had learned to trust my instincts and to document truth, no matter how small it seemed. Mom, too, reflected on her own growth. She admitted, with tears sometimes welling in her eyes, that she had been blind, too trusting, too eager to believe someone's charm without questioning their intentions. But she also acknowledged her strength: the ability to listen, to learn, and ultimately to act decisively when the truth was undeniable. Together, we began to speak openly about boundaries, trust, and protection. We discussed scenarios that had previously caused tension, dissecting how Daniel had manipulated situations and how we would respond differently in the future. It wasn't about paranoia, it was about empowerment. About ensuring that neither of us would ever again be placed in a position where someone could quietly control our lives. Even more importantly, we began to rebuild the bond that had been tested and nearly fractured. The subtle undercurrents of fear and doubt that Daniel had seeded were replaced with transparency, honesty, and communication. Every conversation, every shared activity, reinforced the reality that our relationship was stronger than any external threat.